All right, so what's happening is that in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, there's a significant use of the book of Daniel, chapter 2. I keep wanting to say chapter 12. So in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, when we go to the Hebrew translated into the Greek language, the Greek phrase is zoe, the word for life, and aionios, the word that describes life as the life that we find in a particular age, a particular period of time. And this is the word that we come to in our study of Romans. For the last several months, we've been doing a study on Paul's letter to the Romans. And we've gotten in the letter through chapter 1, through the first 6 verses of chapter 2. But when we come to verse 7, Romans 2, verse 7, we come to a verse which contains this Greek phrase, zoe aionios. We come to Romans 2, verse 7, which contains this phrase, zoe aionios, which means that we're talking about a quality of life that pertains to a period of time which is a single age, a single era, a single time in history, where the quality of life for the people living at the time is going to be the connection with God. So it will be a spiritual quality of life, so that our human life and our spiritual life will be merged into one life. And it'll be the life that God is constantly pouring into us in this age, in this time frame. And that is what the Jewish people were referring to by talking about the Messianic age. The age, the time that the Messiah, the leader, the king, would be on earth. And he would be governing the world. But his rule over the world would bring a quality of life to everybody living on the planet. And so the quality of life in the time that the Messiah is here on planet Earth is called in the Greek language zoe aionios, the life of the Messianic age. And this is the quality of life that Jesus himself is going to bring back to our world when Jesus himself comes in his humanity as Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. When he comes in his own resurrected human body, he's going to be on this earth in the future, and he's going to rule this world. And the quality of life is going to be zoe aionios. It's going to be the life that belongs to the time the Messiah is on earth, which, by the way, is not going to end. Because once he comes back, he's not leaving anymore. He's not leaving us like he did the last time, where he was here for 33 years and he left. He's coming back to stay.
Nice.
And and so what's happening is that when Paul is writing this letter to the Roman congregation, the one that we've been on for several months, we've gone through chapter 1, we've gone through the first 6 verses of chapter 2. But now when we come to Romans chapter 2, verse 7, then we get this phrase in the Greek version here, zoe aionios, the life of the Messianic age. And this theme in Romans chapter 2, verse 7 that is introduced in the verse that we thought that we would start with tonight in our discussion was right there at Romans chapter 2, verse 7, because that's the one that we didn't do the last time that we did our talk. We got through Romans chapter 2, verses 1 to 6 last discussion. Now we're on to the next verse, which is Romans 2, verse 7. But I said earlier tonight that in Romans chapter 2, verse 7, this theme of zoe aionios runs all the way through the end of chapter 2, into chapter 3, into chapter 4, into chapter 5, into chapter 6, all the way to the end of chapter 6, when we find in Romans 6, verse 23, that the gift of God is zoe aionios. That's the gift of God. Zoe aionios. And this gift in Romans 6:23 is found in the person of Jesus. So he is the king who brings this quality of life to everybody on the planet when he comes, and it's a gift, right? But what was happening here is that in Romans chapter 2, verse 7, when the apostle is writing in verse 7 about this Zoe Ionios, he's not looking at it in terms of the way that I'm looking at it. He was looking at it from the standpoint of how were the Jewish people of Paul's day thinking in terms of how this phrase in the Greek translation of the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, where that same Zoe Ionios in the Greek version is used, in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, the only time in the entire Jewish scriptures translated into Greek where that's used, Zoe Ionios, in that Greek phrase, the only time it's used in the entire Jewish Bible is the one time in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, and that's when that Hebrew was translated into the Greek, Zoe Ionios. So it's found right there in Genesis. I should have said the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2. But what happened is the Jewish people of Paul's day were interpreting the meaning of Zoe Ionios through the lens of Daniel 12:2. In other words, it was that was the verse that the Jewish people of Paul's day were looking at that was causing them to say, what does this Daniel 12:2 mean? What does this Zoe Ionios mean? Because Daniel 12:2 itself, when you read the verse, did not tell you anything about really the meaning of it, other than it was describing a quality of life, but you really didn't know by reading Daniel 12:2 how you got the life. You really didn't know. I mean, it was just like some get it. Daniel 12:2 says some get the life and some others don't. Okay, because Daniel 12:2 is giving the statement that when people have physically died, there is that future time when they will physically come back to life, so that in Daniel 12:2, those that are sleeping in the dust of the earth, which is what the verse says, Daniel 12:2, those that are sleeping in the dust of the earth. Well, in the Jewish scriptures, sleeping in the dust of the earth was a symbol of the fact that even though you physically died, it's like you're asleep, because one day in the future you're going to wake up and you're going to come back to life in your physical body to be on earth again with your humanity restored by a resurrection of the body. Well, that's what Daniel 12:2 is referring to when it says that many who are sleeping in the dust of the earth will awake. Like they're reminding me a little bit in Daniel 12:2, reminding me a little bit of another verse, Isaiah 26:19, because in Isaiah 26:19, the verse says, your dead people will live. Their bodies will rise. Well, in the King James Bible, it actually says, your dead people will live, together with my dead body they will arise. Which is very significant, that
because he rose in the body.
Because he rose in the body, and then we rise together with him to join his resurrection experience in the body, which of course is guaranteed for the time that he comes back to earth to rule the world, with everybody having the quality of Zoe Ionios when he comes back. Well, in the time of Paul's writing the letter of Romans, the Jewish people were giving all these interpretations based on their teachers, their rabbis. The Hebrew word rabbi means teacher. So their teachers were giving a lot of different interpretations of how you thought in Paul's day, how you thought you could get a hold of that life. Like when you come back to life in the body on earth, what do you have to do to get the life? Because the verse itself in Daniel 12:2 says, some get the life, but others get the opposite of life. In other words, others are going to get shame and disgrace, like they're living on earth, and they're living a crummy life, just like they were living a crummy life before they died. They wake up and they resurrect in their body, they're still living a crummy life. Well, the thing is about this, that is the only statement in the entire Jewish Bible. Daniel 12:2 is the only statement in the entire Jewish Bible where you get the idea of somebody died and then they come back to life and they feel like they're back in Genesis chapter 3, feeling like they're in shame and disgrace and hiding behind a tree, like Adam hiding behind a tree because God's present in the garden and I feel like I'm naked and I'm ashamed, so I don't want him to see where I am. Well, this is the characteristic of Daniel 12:2. Like some people get this fellowship with God, this blessing of knowing God in a personal way, and then others are, as if to say, off in their own little community where they're just all separated from God's presence on earth, and they're all just experiencing shame and disgrace, and as if we're going to have a repeat of Romans chapter 7 verse 24. Oh, miserable person that I am. Well, obviously, because this is the only verse in the entire Jewish Bible that gives the idea of after somebody's died, after someone has died, they potentially come back to life either with this blessing of a quality of life or this curse of, well, this is a crummy life again. I died, I thought that would end the crummy life. Now I resurrect and here it is again. Well, that is the only verse in the entire Jewish Bible that gives that thought. Somebody died, and not everybody gets a good quality of life, but some get a crappy quality of life. Well, Paul, in writing Romans chapter 2, verse 7, is going to take the Jewish people's thinking of the day, which is about how you get the quality of life and how you avoid the shame and the disgrace. And what the Apostle Paul is doing in Romans 2:7 is going to talk about the way that the Jewish people think it's going to work is you getting this quality of life if it is a reward for the works that you performed. So that's what Paul's going to do. He's going to say, okay, let's take your idea, Jewish people, of the fact that we need to do these works to get our reward of this quality of life, and so he's gonna start saying, okay, let's go with your thought that we should work for it, and then he sets that up in Romans 2:7 and goes all the way through the rest of chapter 6 verse 23, meaning like from Romans, he uses that phrase zoe aionios. He used the phrase in Romans 2:7. Then he uses the phrase again in Romans 6:23. Because in Romans 6:23 is when he says that quality of life is a gift of God. It's not something that in Romans 2:7 you have to work for. Because Paul's taking the Jewish people's thinking of the day and saying, well, let's go with your attempt to work at it and see if that's actually going to be a reality, that you're going to be rewarded in that way for your good works. Right? So in Romans 2:7 he says, now for those people, for that crowd out there that is seeking glory, this is Romans 2:7. For the crowd out there that's seeking glory, seeking honor, and seeking what the NIV says is immortality, meaning a quality of life that makes you feel totally alive rather than, oh, I resurrected in the body, now I want to die again because I'm miserable. No, this is a quality of life, zoe aionios, that you want to live. You don't want to die. Just like Romans 6 verse 9 about Jesus. He resurrected and he dies no more. So, this is the quality of life that you don't want to die after getting this quality of life, right? So Paul is saying in Romans 2:7, those people out there, you Jewish people that are seeking this glory, this honor, this immortality, which is a quality of life with no death attached to the experience of living. Okay, Romans 2:7. Those who are seeking glory, honor, and immortality, God will give zoe aionios. And then he says in verse 8 that there's going to be this wrath and this anger, against the people that are self-seeking and reject what is evil. Does anybody have the Romans 2:8? I mean, something along the lines of those who are self-seeking, who reject the truth and follow evil. I think that's what it is. Romans 8:2-8. Those who those who are self-seeking, who reject the truth and follow evil. Well, and what does Romans 2:9 say? Something along the lines of there'll be trouble and distress for every human being that does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, but the Gentile is the non-Jew, whoever's not Jewish, right? Jews and the non-Jews, well, Jew versus Gentile. Well, that meant anybody on the planet was considered either a Jew or a non-Jew, to include everybody by saying Jew and non-Jew or Jew and Gentile. That's meaning anybody on the earth, right? So in the, okay, thank you, man, thank you. So that this is great that Josh just gave me this to me. So in that Romans 2, I might as well go back to Josh's verse. Let's see, verse 7. I might as well go back to Josh's verse 7 because he gave this to me. I might as well read it right out of here. Remember, we've been talking about Romans 2:7. Well, Josh has a version which is going to say in Romans 2:7 that this Zoe Ionios is going to be to those people who by patient continuance, in other words, they're patiently and at the same time continuing to work at it, as they're patiently continuing to work at it, they're seeking for glory, honor, and immortality, which is a quality of life with no death. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey that which is not right, obey unrighteousness, then for those people it'll be, anger, wrath, trouble, distress on every soul that does evil, whether it be the Jew, and it even says the Jew first, but then also those that are the Gentile or the non-Jew, or literal translation would be the Greek, because the Jew thought that you were either a Jew or a Greek, because the cultures were entirely different. The Jewish culture was about knowing God, the Greeks were about knowing self. So it was all about the idea of, culturally, you were either a Jew or a Greek. And so Paul is saying that the Jew, the Greek, that everybody that screws up, well, they're going to, according to Daniel 12:2, they're going to pay with their shame and disgrace type of an idea, right? So what Paul is doing is he's getting now into verse 10. Okay, Romans 2, verse 10. And he's saying, Paul does, but for those of you out there that are seeking the glory and the honor and the peace, when you're seeking that, glory, honor, and peace, then to everyone who's doing that, patiently continuing to seek that, then to everyone who does that work that is characterized as good work, to the Jew first or also to the Greek, then that's the person that's going to get rewarded, who's seeking that, whether they're the Jew or the Greek, that's seeking that. And then it says in the verse 11, for there is no partiality with God. Like God's not favoring the Jew over the Greek or the Greek over the Jew. There's no favoritism with God, right? That's what Romans 2:11 is saying. Okay. Now, having said that about the Romans 2:7 through 11, okay? Let's just take a moment to cross-reference a statement in chapter 3. Romans chapter 3, I just want to cross-reference a statement. Because having gone through Romans 2, verses 7 through 11, I now want to cross-reference this with a statement in chapter 3. And the statement in chapter 3 is in verse 9. I'm just going to read this in verse 9. So, thanks for letting me borrow this, Josh. So, this is Romans chapter 3, verse 9. What then? Meaning, like, what should we talk about now? What then? Are we Jews better than they, who are the Greeks or the non-Jews? Are we Jews any better than the non-Jews? That's the question he's raising. What then? Because Paul, who's writing this, is Jewish. So, the question in Romans 3:9, what then? Are we better than they, the non-Jews? And then he says, not at all. We're not better than them. Not at all. For we have previously charged guilty both Jews and Greeks of all being under the power of sin. So that power of sin started dominating the lives of both Jewish people and non-Jewish people. I mean, Greek and Jew. And this power of sin that Paul is going to start elaborating on in the following verses is something that took everybody by surprise, of course, when way back in Genesis chapter 4, God is speaking to the son of Adam and Eve, whose name is Cain. He's speaking, Genesis 4, God is speaking to the son of Adam and Eve, whose name is Cain. And God is telling Cain, this sin power is crouching at your door. This sin power desires to take a hold of you, and then God says, but you must master it. In other words, this sin power is crouching at your door, but it's trying to get in and attack you, but you gotta create the scenario where you can overcome it. You must master this thing. Well, you know, Paul later on, when he wrote the 7th chapter of Romans, talked about his own experience of trying to do what God told Cain to do, and that was to overcome the sin power. And Paul was saying in Romans chapter 7, verses 7, like Romans 7, verse 7, all the way to the end of chapter 7, I couldn't defeat this sin power. I couldn't defeat it. I mean, even when I tried not to do it, I still did it. I couldn't get rid of this sin problem. Wretched man, miserable man that I am. Romans 7:24. Who's going to rescue me from this experience? Well, Paul was basically saying to his people, you know, when he's writing this letter, all the way from Romans chapter 2, verse 7, all the way through to chapter 3, verses 9 and following, he's saying, if we're going to believe what you Jews are believing in your theology, your belief about God and belief about the future resurrection, if it's going to be based on this work that you're required to do, then according to all these scriptures that Paul is going to list in a minute, he's going to list a bunch of scriptures in a minute. I mean, he's going to allude to the Psalms, he's going to allude to the prophets, and he's going to give verse after verse that's going to say, not one human being is doing what it would take to get your reward in Daniel 12:2, to get your reward by what you have done to accomplish something that would be so honorable that God would say, well, because of you really trying so hard, I'm going to give you your reward. Well, Paul's not even giving anybody credit after all the verses that he's fixing to quote in the remainder of Romans 3. He's going to quote so many verses from his own Bible that's going to be, nobody is getting the job done. You know, nobody's work is being approved of by God here, because you got to be perfect. He even says later on in Romans 3, he even says in verse 23, he says, all have sinned and everyone continues, because the Greek into English is literally that everyone continues to fall short of the glory of God. Yeah, back in Romans 2:7, you're seeking the glory. Yeah, but guess what? Romans 3:23, everybody's falling short of that glory. You know, all have sinned and everybody keeps falling short of it. And the Greek into English is even suggesting that God made the standard so high that it would be impossible for you to attain that glory. Greek is using a feature of the language called what we call in Greek the passive voice, which you don't have to know passive voice terminology, but it just means that God is preventing you from being able to attain the glory because he set this standard so high that you continue to fall short of reaching it because it's too much above your humanity to be able to reach the very nature of God that could live perfect. And we can't do it. That's why we can't have the glory, because that would be like us living perfect, so give the glory to us because we earn it. But with God, it's either all or nothing. Either you give him 100% obedience like Jesus did, or you get no credit for keeping any of the law. Remember James 2:10, remember that letter later on, James 2:10 is saying if you keep the whole law but you just stumble or trip and fall at one part of the requirement of the law, if you just fail to fulfill one requirement of the law, then you're guilty of breaking the rest of the law, because the only way you can get credit for keeping any part of it is to have kept the whole thing, and nobody has done it. So Romans 3 verse 9, what then? Are we any better than they are? Not at all. For we've previously charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under the power of sin. As it is written in the Jewish scriptures, this is getting into verses 10 and following, Romans 3 verses 10 and following, as it is written in the Jewish scriptures, there's none who've lived right. No, not one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks after God. Because remember, to get credit for seeking after God, you got to do it all the time. Not just part of your life. You got to do it your whole life like Jesus did. Right? If you're going to get the reward of the quality of life based on a reward system, you got to do what Jesus did. Because he said, he set the standard.
God can only reward himself.
God can only reward himself. Amen.
And we're in him.
Amen. And we are in him because we're represented by him. So we're in our representative. Humanity's represented. Who, when he did it on behalf of everyone. And that's what Romans 6:23 is later going to say, that this Zoe Ionis is a gift of God that is found in the representative, Jesus, who is our King and our Lord. So Romans 3:10 is saying that everyone has turned aside from God. They've together become unprofitable, meaning that God's not investing in our human nature to say, well, you know what? You really didn't need Jesus because you could do it on your own. Your human nature was good enough. You didn't need my spirit, like that type thing, right? And then at the end of Romans 3:10, there's none who does good, no, not one. Okay? And then Psalm 5 is going to be alluded to here in Romans 3. I want to say verse 11, when it says their throat is an open tomb.
Verse 13.
Oh, that's verse 13? Well, thank you, George. Thank you, George, to pointing out that what I'm on to is Romans 3:13. Okay? Thank you, George. Their throat is an open tomb. With their tongues they practiced deceit, like lying. Well, this statement in Psalm 5 is talking about people that live immoral lives. But in Psalm 5, when it's talking about that type of person, their throat is an open tomb, their tongues are practicing deceit, or they're liars and that type of thing. Psalm 5 is condemning people that they're like that in the way that they can't stop lying. Well, Paul is saying that applies to everybody. The same way as in the letter of James chapter 3, verse 8. If we borrow James chapter 3, verse 8, it says no human being can tame the tongue. No human being can tame the tongue. That we can, because it says right there in the beginning of the chapter of James 3, it says, if anybody could tame their tongue, then they'd be a perfect person, able to keep their whole body in check if they could control their tongue. And so Paul's saying, these people that are accused of not being able to control their tongue in Psalm 5, this is what Paul is doing in Romans chapter 3, verse 13. He's alluding to Psalm 5 about people that, can't stop lying. Well, Paul is saying that applies to all humanity. Because if you've ever done it once, if you've ever lied once, then you've broken the law that says thou shalt not lie. You only had to do it once. So you're not going to get credit for living right if you lied once. Because you're in the category of no human can tame the tongue in James 3:8. And I don't want to go into detail, but I know that I've lied before. I'm going to admit it. I actually have lied before. Okay, so I'm in Paul's group of the rest of humanity.
Wow, I would think.
Yeah. So this is what Paul is doing. In Romans 3, at the end of verse 13, he says, the poison of this type of snake, because my Bible right here is saying the poison of asps, but I believe that it is a type of snake, okay? Like a venom, a poison. Their tongue is like so dangerous by speaking lies and other things. It's like the poison of a snake, the way that they talk. The poison of this type of snake here, the poison of asps, is under their lips. Well, that's alluding to another verse, and I believe it's from like Psalm 140. I believe that it's actually Psalm 140 that verse is alluding to. The poison of asps is under their lips. Okay, but Paul is continuing to quote Jewish scriptures when he says in the next verse, their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Well, that's another quote from the Jewish scriptures. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. And then another quote from the Jewish scriptures. Their feet are in a hurry to murder people. Or another way of symbolizing that in the Hebrew scriptures, to shed blood. Which means to murder somebody is to shed their blood. Their feet are in a hurry to shed blood. And that's another quote from Jewish scripture. Another one, destruction and misery are in their paths. Well, that's quoted from Jewish scripture. And the way of peace, they don't know the way of peace. They don't know the way of peace. Okay, but that's quoting another Jewish scripture. And then finally, Paul gets down there to Romans 3:18, and he's quoting Psalm 36:1. When he quotes Psalm 36:1, down here in his writing of it, Romans 3:18, and I'm going to quote the Psalm 36:1 here in Romans 3:18. There's no reverence for God before their eyes. Like they don't have a view of God where they reverence him or honor him or worship him or really care about what he wants for their life. They have no reverence for God before their eyes. Okay. And then he's going to make this comment. He's going to say in verse 19, Romans 3:19, he's going to say, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. Like the Jewish people of Paul's day that were under the law. Okay? Well, the law is talking to you. Paul is saying to these Jewish people, the law is talking to you. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those that are under the law. That every mouth may be shut. Like them confessing their right living before God. Well, the law was designed to make them realize that they failed at being what would be required to have God reward you because you kept the law. So in Romans 3:19, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and that the whole world would become guilty before God. The whole world would become guilty before God? Well, that would mean that if it was based on Daniel 12:2, that you had to work to get your reward of the quality of life on the side of bodily resurrection, to have life on earth be good in the presence of God, then the whole world would be, according to Daniel 12:2, in timeout, so to speak. Off in a little community apart from where the Messiah's kingdom is, and everybody in the community would be in shame and disgrace. The only problem is the whole community would be the population of the entire world. Because everybody would be getting the sort of punishment of the Daniel 12:2, the shame and disgrace. Everybody would be getting it, just like in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, the whole world lived a crummy life with shame and disgrace. All humanity experienced that. So now it's like to be reincarnated, to have that happen again? I mean, that'd be like the Hindu religion that believes in a reincarnation, and some people have a crummy life, so they get resurrected with a crummy life, but with a chance to try to do a little bit better until they're resurrected a third time or a fourth time because of the concept of reincarnation from the Hindu religion, but all because you're trying to earn your Zoe Aionios. Whether it's the Hindu religion or the whatever religion, it doesn't matter. It's all the same principle. You're trying to earn something that Romans 6:23 says is a gift. The gift of God is Zoe Aionios, in the representative who's attained the reward by keeping the whole law and not be guilty of doing anything wrong. Even his very words, Jesus' very words, he was able to tame the tongue. So, I mean, I'm just trying to say the gift of God is that Jesus did it all. He kept the whole law, and he did it as a representative of the human race, so that on the basis of the reward thinking of the Jewish people of Paul's day, to talk to people about the reward and punishment system, then everybody would get the punishment, and nobody but Jesus would get the reward. So Jesus would be the only one living with quality of life in his kingdom, and everybody that he rules over on the planet, the whole world's population, would be in shame and disgrace. And they would be getting their punishment like it was Genesis 3, reincarnated to live in Genesis 3 again with shame and disgrace. Well, Paul is not going for this Daniel 12:2. Okay, he's not going for it. He's talking about how it doesn't work. Okay, but it's another subject for another sunny night to talk about why Paul isn't going for Daniel 12:2. Because he's not going for it, and he's talking to the people about how this system of works doesn't work. And it's not going to apply just to a few, meaning that the failure to have done what God required would not just be a few that would have failed, but the whole world other than Jesus would have failed. So Paul's not going for Daniel 12:2, or the mindset of the Judaism of the day, which believed that the foundation of their Jewish understanding of the relationship with God was Daniel 12:2. That's what they thought was their foundation. Paul's not going for it. He says in 1 Corinthians 3:11 that the foundation is Jesus the Messiah. And that's the only foundation that can be laid. And he's the foundation, Jesus the Messiah. And there's no other foundation that can be laid. All right? Okay. So having said that, you just said you don't have to do anything to earn it. That's the reason why Paul, knowing the people of his day, were into this mindset of reward and punishment.
Yeah.
And he was borrowing the phrase right from Daniel 12:2, which was in the same Greek language that he was writing his letter in. He was borrowing from the Greek translation of the Hebrew into the Greek for Daniel 12:2. But it's Zoe Aionios, the quality of life in the Messianic age, the new covenant age, when God gives you his Spirit and he gives you the fruit of the right living that comes from the Spirit that is now directing your life rather than the old required law that your human nature was supposed to be successful at obeying. Well, what happens is Paul had set the stage up in Romans 2, verses 7 to 11, and he had set it up where to those who are persistently and patiently continuing to go forward in their mission to seek for the glory and the honor and the immortality, then they would be given the reward of Zoe Aionios, but for those that are self-seeking, that they, reject the truth and they're self-seeking, and they're going to get this shame and disgrace that Daniel 12:2 is talking about. Well, Paul makes the point that George just made, that would mean that it would be a negative message for the entire world. Because Paul said just now in Romans 3:19 that the whole point of giving people the law was to show that nobody was going to be successful at being able to keep the whole law, so the whole world would be considered guilty before God, which is what is stated in this Bible right here, Romans 3:19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those that are under the law, that every mouth would be silenced, and all the world, the whole world, would become guilty before God. Verse 20, Romans 3:20, going on to the next verse. Therefore, by the works required by the law, no human being will be successful in God's sight. Rather, the law was given so that we would have the knowledge that we failed to keep it. It says right here in Romans 3:20, the law is the knowledge of sin, meaning that we didn't attain what it was that we had to attain to get the reward. And so having said that, Paul is going to go into the Romans 3:21 to 26, and we won't do Romans 3:21 to 26 tonight, because Romans 3:21 to 26 is a summary of the good news of what Jesus accomplished for everyone, and we won't be able to get to that tonight.
When you just read that verse where it says, but through law is like a full knowledge of sin.
Right.
It reminds me of many other verses that Paul used that said that. But the one that just came to mind really fast was when Paul says, the sting of death is sin.
Yeah.
And the power of sin is the law.
Yeah.
And I don't know if many people understand that really kind of happens that way, that the power of sin is the law.
Yes.
Because, you know, the harder we try, that's our getting under law and just trying harder, because the law says don't do this, so I try harder not to do this.
Right.
But Paul really made the case, and you know this because in all his letters, he just mentions that, it sounds great to try to do the law, but the fact is the law was given to show you that you can't do it, which is is that counterintuitive.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just wonder if a lot of people see that, that
I don't believe so, because I had not seen it for decades and decades of seeking God very strongly, because of the way God revealed himself to me as a teenager. And then my whole adult life, I'm 69 now, my whole adult life, I was just really seeking to understand as much as possible what God was saying in the entirety of the scriptures. And I never was able to feel successful. I was always feeling the Romans chapter 7 teaching, which we haven't gotten to yet, but later on we get to Romans chapter 7, where he starts talking about the fact that the sin is a power that feeds off of the fact that the law is requiring something of us as humans that we literally have no human capacity to accomplish. We have no human capacity to obey the whole law, which is what would be required. We have no capacity to do it. I mean, even as he says it later on in Romans 7, verse 14, he says, well, the law to be attained would be attained spiritually. But we, being unspiritual in that way, would not be able to attain something spiritual because we're unspiritual. In fact, he goes on to say in Romans 7:14, we're sold on the slave market, because they had slaves in Paul's day. We're sold on the slave market to Mr. Sin, which is presented by Paul as a power, as if it was a slave master that would make us sin even when we were fighting against it, but we would still sin. And if it wasn't in one area of our life that sin got us, it'd be in another area of our life that sin would get us. Like if I felt like I had victory over one thing, God, you gave me victory over it. Well, I got 100 things more to get victory over, which I've not gotten victory over, 99% of those. So God says it's got to be perfection. So the whole world is held accountable to God, in Romans 3:19, and then Romans 3:20. When George said the full knowledge is the Greek word for the full knowledge, that's correct. Epignosis does mean the full knowledge. In other words, Romans 3:20, right here, Romans 3:20. Therefore, by the works required by the law, no human being will be successful in the sight of God. Rather, the law is synonymous with the full knowledge of shortcoming. Because the word sin itself, the Greek word hamartia, is the idea that the archer is aiming at a target and missing the target. So even when we're trying to practice to be a good archer, we're still missing the target. I mean, even though we try, we can't get it. Because it's perfection. And Jesus is the only one with the perfection. So he's the one that is the representative of humanity. So he's the gift of God. For in Romans 6:23 we read he's the gift of God. And that's why his quality of life, based on the reward that he gets, is shared with the whole human race. Because he's our representative. Because in Romans 6:23 it's the gift of God that's Zoe Ionios, that's in the representative, Jesus our King.
So really just
Where's our
about
Lord?
relationship with God.
Yeah.
Just enjoying your relationship, and that's it.
That's it.
And he's
That's it.
unwiring us from
That's
the
it.
liar, the consciousness that sprung to life.
Yeah.
And the reason why we're suffering is because we're still trying to perform, thinking we're
Right.
doing God's work by
And-
letting go. But even in the letting go is performance.
It is.
Spending intimate time with
Exactly.
Him.
It is.
Exactly.
It is.
It is.
It's just like there's no trying, there's being. And if you're trying
Exactly.
for a role, and
Exactly.
if your role then basically agrees with the rest of the roles in the world, and then you got to perform in order to eat. But
Yeah.
what's happening is basically we have to die to the way of the world, and that's suffering. And then basically, then we stop believing in God, and then we need to be satisfied with the world again, and then we go out and we indulge within the world, but then die again, over and over again.
Until we get the
intimacy with God. And it's got to be intimacy, and it's only intimacy that we let go, is we can't trust what we don't believe in, and who we don't know.
And then as God has given us a new covenant promise, which is Jesus came back to life to be the mediator of a new way of living, a new agreement about how we would live, and it would be with no consciousness of failure at all. It would be the complete opposite of Romans 3:20. The full knowledge of shortcoming, the full knowledge of sin, it would be completely opposite. It would be no consciousness of sin. Like Hebrews chapter 10 verse 2 talks about they'd no longer feel guilty for their sins because they wouldn't have any consciousness of shortcoming. Because the new covenant is based entirely on Jesus, the one that is successful at keeping the whole law on behalf of the whole human race. And therefore, by learning more about Jesus and how he is God's gift to the human race, and then more and more hearing about him being the one that was able to overcome every sin. Even in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, he is the one that empathizes with our weaknesses as human beings. He empathizes with our weaknesses because he was tempted in every way that we human beings are tempted, yet he didn't give in to the temptation. But he's the only one.
When Cain was told about by God to master the sin,
Yeah.
what could he have done really?
Just have what God just told him end up being the thing that triggered the sin power, because the next thing you know, and Romans 7 teaches the fact that the law is the power source behind the sin manifesting itself in action, because that's what we saw in Genesis 4. God says you must master sin, and next thing you know, this guy Cain kills his brother Abel. I mean, like right after God says you must master sin, all right? But the complete opposite is in Romans 6:14, right? The complete opposite is in Romans 6:14, which is sin will not be your master, because you're not under the old agreement with God that you have to perform. So there's no rebellion that springs to life because there's nothing to rebel against.
Right.
You know, remember Romans 6:14. Sin doesn't get mastery over you because you're not under this requirement to obey a law. You're under grace, which is that Jesus already obeyed all the law for you, and you already have the credit in the grace of him doing it for you. And then what that does is it allows for the Romans 7:22, which is in my inner being, I'm happy with what God's good, pleasing, and perfect will is.
Right.
Remember that, Romans 7:22?
Yeah.
In my inner being, I delight in the teaching of God. Like, what's the good way to live in Micah 6:8? Micah the prophet, chapter 6, verse 8. You know, how does the Lord want you to live? Well, he wants you to treat people fairly and he wants you to be merciful to people, and he wants you to walk humbly with your God. Well, you know, that's a good way to live, and my inner being in Romans 7:22, my inner being wants to live that way. But when I'm under a system of government where I'm required to try to not sin, being a human, I'm going to sin and then feel guilty and then feel further away from God than when the day started, and then piling up failure after failure in my mind and that guilty conscience. Next thing you know, I'm losing love for God daily. And then eventually I get to the end of the rope at Romans 7 verse 24. He gets to the end of the rope, Paul does. He says, I want to die. That's what he says in Romans 7:24. Who's going to rescue me from my body that feels like I've already died? I feel like I'm a living corpse. Who's going to rescue me from this? And then he says, well, Jesus is going to rescue me from this, right? And then he proceeds to talk in the next chapter of Romans 8 about how Jesus has spiritually rescued the whole human race. And now we just need to learn about the new agreement, the new covenant relationship, the way that Hebrews 10 verse 22 calls the new and living way. You know, the new and living way, which is a way to live that Paul said, I teach the babies, which I have to explain what I mean. Why does Paul say he teaches babies? Because in 1 Corinthians 4, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, he's talking to a congregation that he is comparing to babies because of their spiritual development. He's saying that you guys are on the level of a baby. You're not ready for this complete, consistent teaching about the new way of life by the grace of God. You just can't absorb it. You just can't handle this. You know, sin doesn't have mastery over you because you're no longer required to do anything. God does everything for you. Well, as a baby, you can't process that. As a baby, you know, you don't have the capacity to grasp that, right? So Paul is saying to them, you know, in 1 Corinthians 4:17, even though you're babies, he is introducing the babies in that letter of 1 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 17. He is introducing them to a concept. Even though you guys can't walk in this, even though God, you people, he's planting a seed. He's planting a seed in 1 Corinthians 4:17 that he knows that they can't walk in it yet. He knows that it's not like you can walk around as an adult if you're like 6 months old. If you're 6 months old, you can't walk around like an adult, right? But he's planting a seed with these people, as Kyle was pointing out. He's planting a seed because he's giving them a concept. He's giving them an idea. He's giving them a thought to think about. And that very thought is what I started thinking about in 1977. I was at Bible college. A student at Bible college shared this with me in 1977. And it was a thought. I couldn't walk in it, but it was a thought. I meditated on it. I studied more about it. I thought about it. And the more real the thought came to me, I started years later beginning to walk in it. And then I started thinking about it more, started walking in it more. Okay, but God's not condemning anybody. He's not charging anybody with guilt because Jesus is the new covenant mediator, and the new covenant promise from Jeremiah 31 is that God would make a new covenant. And he says in Jeremiah 31:34 that the essence of this new covenant is God's not remembering shortcoming, he's not remembering fault, he's not remembering rebellion, he's not remembering sin. He doesn't even have that in his mind. He's forgiven and forgotten all of that stuff.
So if we
That's self-absorbed.